The theory among historians and social scientists in the 20th century was that religion was on its way out the door, and the global trend seemed to point towards atheism and agnosticism. And by the 1970s, this seemed to be true, because in 1910, 1% of the global population would have self-identified as being non-religious. And by 1970, 19%. However, by 2015, that number was back down to 11% of the global population that consider themselves to be non-religious. Now, it's true that non-religion is increasing in places like Europe and the US. However, globally, the trend seems to say that most people continue to associate with one of the world's religions. One statistic that shows this is in the year 1800, 33% of the world was either Christian or Muslim. If trends continue, by 2100, 66% of the world will be either Christian or Muslim. So it's important as we seek to understand global Christianity to be aware of the other world's religions and even those who are non-religious and how and where Christians interact with them. Last week we talked about the 1040 window, and what's interesting is that the largest concentrations of adherents to other world religions are in those regions, stretching from North Africa all the way across into East Asia. So some examples. If you look at India, there are almost 1 billion Hindus in that region. 94% of Hindus are in India. Or Buddhism. There are almost 500 million Buddhists in the world, in places especially like China and Japan and throughout Southeast Asia. Or Sikhs, 25 million of them, majority of them in India. Jews, there are 14 million of them globally. 80% of them are split between Israel and the US. But I'd like us to concentrate on Islam for a second and the 1.6 billion people who consider themselves Muslim. Now, the majority of Muslims in the world are in the 1040 window or along the edge of it. Now, what's interesting is that the largest numbers of Muslims in the world are not in the Middle East or North Africa. Actually, 62% of all Muslims in the world are east of Iraq. In fact, the 4 countries with the largest population of Muslims are Indonesia, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. All 4 of them have over 100 million Muslims. The next closest is well below that. However, as far as percentage of the population or density of Muslims in an area, well, the Middle East and North Africa definitely lead the way. 93% of the population in North Africa and Middle East are Muslim. So in most of the countries in the 1040 window, Christians live as minorities among people of other religions. And this often leads to conflict and persecution. But it's not always just between Muslims and Christians. In fact, it happens among other religions as well. For example, you have conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India, or Buddhists persecuting Muslims in Myanmar, or Jewish and Muslim conflict in Israel and Palestine. And as far as Christians go and our brothers and sisters who are persecuted, sometimes that persecution is state-sanctioned. It's not really about religion, especially in places like China, North Korea. And then you do have Christians being persecuted in India by the Hindu majority as well. However, the majority of the conflict and the majority of the persecution of Christians happens in the Muslim majority world. Now, obviously from the news, you know it happens in places like Syria and Iraq at the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But it also happens in other countries such as Eritrea or Pakistan, Iran, all the way over into Indonesia. And it even affects countries and political boundaries where Muslims and Christians are divided in the country. Places like Nigeria, Sudan, which now is split off, and there's now South Sudan, and there's still conflict there, or even Lebanon. But it's important to remember as we think about our brothers and sisters in Christ being persecuted, that the majority of the violence perpetrated by Islamic extremists and terrorists is done against other Muslims. Now, we could focus just on the conflict and the violence in this region of the world and how different religions can't get along at times. But in actuality, throughout history and throughout the world, there are actually a lot of examples of people coming together across religious boundaries and dialoguing and sharing meals together and living in harmony. The problem is that those stories don't get told very well. In fact, I was at a conference recently in Bethlehem on peacemaking in the face of religious extremism, and we heard from a Muslim scholar, and he was pointing this out, saying that even there in Jerusalem, where all so much conflict happens, he says the media never will come in and cover a meal between a Christian and a Muslim and how they share together and sit around the table. That's not newsworthy. And yet it's happening. And we need to celebrate and highlight those types of stories. The theologian Hans Küng once wrote, "There will be no peace among civilizations without peace among the religions. There will be no peace among the religions without dialogue between the religions." And it's that type of sentiment that led us to the third initiative of the Restore the World vision. Restoring the world by making peace in the Muslim majority world. Now, this initiative comes out of a recognition that in the world today, so many of us are consumed with fear and hatred and mistrust, and we see the violence around the world. And we want to be intentional with becoming agents of peace and reconciliation. And so we want to think about how to do that in the Muslim majority world. And we recognize the best way to do that, to be agents of peace and reconciliation and to take on the violence and conflict, is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. People who are willing to love radically like Jesus. So that means making disciples in the Muslim majority world, to share the good news with them and to help train leaders and make disciples in churches there so they'll be a light in that part of the world. But also make disciples here. How do we help people become more like Jesus and to practice the way of peace and self-sacrificing love and mercy and compassion and not give in to fear? And we also want to find organizations and churches who are doing good and intentional work in the area of peacemaking in the Muslim majority world. But we recognize that this is a huge endeavor, much bigger than us, and we're not prepared yet to do this. And so part of this initiative is to set aside the next few years to prepare Highland to enter into this type of ministry. So we're going to take some time to learn, to listen, to study, to understand Islam, to see how Christians and Muslims have gotten along in the past and how they do now throughout the world. And we're going to spend time praying, asking the Spirit to lead us in this endeavor, to see how we can partner with God in this, to discern where we need to focus. Because right now, that's a broad initiative, the whole Muslim majority world. And so over these next few years, we're going to investigate and research and look into who's doing what and where good things are happening. And so we're going to narrow that focus into particular regions and to partner with particular organizations. We're excited about where this will lead. And this isn't just about learning how to love our Muslim neighbors in North Africa or in Asia, but also how to do that here. Because more and more, we're going to come into contact with Muslims and people of other religions. In fact, did you know that Fort Bend County in the area of Houston is the most ethnically diverse county in the world? And this means also that it's one of the most religiously diverse. But also here in Abilene, as we receive refugees in other cities around Texas and the U.S., as more and more immigrants come, we are going to have opportunities to be agents of peace and reconciliation, to be disciples of Jesus, to practice the way of radical hospitality among those people. And so as we move forward into this initiative, I pray that you will be open to how the Spirit is forming you and shaping you to resist the pull of fear and hatred and mistrust and violence, and instead become people who are intentionally seeking the way of peace and reconciliation among our global neighbors.